Actually, I actually had started a YouTube channel during my time teaching at Berkeley in 2016. And eventually in 2020, I actually quit the classroom and became a full-time uh, public YouTube instructor, kind of a freelance professor, if you will, to whoever wants to listen to be talk about the subjects that I teach about. So part of that kind of outreach that I do is give talks to groups like yours, and so I hope that I can maybe spark your curiosity about a couple things and even answer whatever questions you might have that are connected closely or maybe a little bit more distantly to what I plan to talk to you about today, which was the myths of heroes from Norse mythology. So last time in, I think it was March of 2021, the talk that I gave was what we know about Norse mythology and how we know it. So we talked a good bit about the Eddas, right? The books, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, which are the two books written down in the 1200s in Iceland, just to refresh your memory if need be, that record most of what we know today about the medieval traditions of the Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Loki, etc. That is where those now very popular comic book and movie characters ultimately come from, or at least ultimately are originally attested as far as we have any evidence of them. But what I thought I would talk to you about today spins off of that a little bit, because while the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, these books written down in Iceland in the 1200s, contain all these myths, all these stories, all these narratives about the gods, about half of the stories they relate are actually not specifically about or not focused on the gods themselves, again, like Odin, Thor, and Loki, but instead on human heroes. So fully half of the Poetic Edda, which is, I mean, I'm showing you, just by translation, but this is about the size of the actual original manuscript too. Fully half of this is not just about Odin, Thor, Loki, but about these human guys. So these human heroes we might think of as being something like the heroes of a classical work like the Iliad, right? So like in the Iliad, these tales are about humans who are better than us, right? They're smarter, better fighters, stronger, better looking, and they're all these things at once, much more than any of us normal people could be, but they're not gods, right? And the gods take a strong interest in their affairs, right? The gods meddle in their lives. The gods interfere. The gods try to twist their destinies in one direction or another, but they are not themselves on the same plane of gods. They live in our human realm. They go to sometimes recognizable places within the Norse world, Denmark, for example, but they are not themselves of a different species from us. So the Iliad in the classical world is a good analogy. But also, I think maybe the best analogy for modern culture is that these myths of heroes are more or less the Norse Star Wars. They are the stories that get endlessly retold, endlessly kind of tweaked by different tellers, and which also get endlessly referenced and alluded to in all of the other literature, right? So that's definitely what the Iliad is for classical Greece or Rome. It's probably what the Iliad or the Odyssey might have been for 19th century English literature, or maybe Shakespeare occupied a position like this. But in terms of, what references and allusions are people going to get in casual conversation today, the closest equivalent is Star Wars. So what I mean by that is, if I had started this talk by breathing real heavily into this microphone, right? Right. And if I played maybe the Imperial March from Star Wars, if I spoke in a deep Darth Vader type voice, you would get the allusion to Star Wars, and you would get that I was setting myself up as a bad guy, as a villain, by kind of even just lightly or not very directly in words alluding to the character of Darth Vader. Or if I come on here and I talk in kind of backwards English, um, listen, you must. I can't do the Yoda voice very well, but if I do that kind of voice and I talk in kind of backwards syntax, you know that I'm setting myself up as a Yoda-like teacher figure. So in just the same way, all of the Norse sagas are loaded with even pretty subtle from our perspective references to these myths of their great heroes. So the family of heroes who are most prominently referenced and whose stories are most constantly told and retold and refreshed are the heroes called the Volsungs. And I'll actually show you some pictures in a minute, but I'll type this in the chat in case you miss the word that I'm saying. So the Norse language does not have, in its medieval form or even in Iceland today, inherited last names of the kind that we're used to. Right. So my last name is Crawford. My father's last name is Crawford. His father's last name was Crawford. All the way back several generations, even a couple centuries, at least as early as when our last ancestor in Scotland changed his last name before he fled to America because of some kind of felony charge we're not clear about. But in the medieval Norse world, last names aren't inherited. So your last name is your father's name plus son or daughter. So my dad's name is Craig. So in this context, my last name would be Craig's son. My sister would be Claire's daughter, right? Claire, Craig's daughter. If I had a son, he would be Jackson's son. If I had a daughter, she would be Jackson's daughter, right? Nina, Jackson's daughter, or something like that. So Volsung is not a family name. This is not people who have this last name Volsung, but rather Volsung is the first member of the family who becomes a world famous, in a Norse context, hero. And so the people descended from him call themselves the Volsungs in reference to him. It's like if you had a grandfather who was a big, hero in your town, maybe he won the high school football game for your town or something, and everybody remembered him as Jack, the Jack. Then even though my name might be Daniel, people might say, oh, he's a Jack, in reference to, oh, he's descended from that particular guy who was a really big deal. So the Volsungs heroes are all descended from this very early heroic figure, Volsung, and they take their name from him. I hope that makes sense. Stop me at any moment if I can clarify or say something better. I'm going to try closing a window too, because I think you all can see me even if I can't see you. And it might look strange to have the lower third of me in light. Okay, so these heroes descended from Volsung, called the Volsungs. Their stories take up about half of the Poetic Edda, but are also preserved in many, many other places. And intriguingly, certainly from my perspective, intriguingly, some of the oldest poems that are in the Poetic Edda, at least by linguistic evidence, the poems that have the most archaic Old Norse language, are actually about these Volsung heroes, not about gods. The two poems that we can confirm by linguistic evidence are the very oldest in the Poetic Edda, actually do concern the Volsungs. They have language that suggests they were actually composed perhaps as early as the 800s AD, which is incredible given that the compilation is only written down in the 1200s AD. So not only are these stories very popular, but they get established in what you could call kind of classic forms that aren't even getting tampered with very much over the centuries. which is really surprising given how much stories get told and retold endlessly in oral transmission. So, questions, remarks at this point, with me kind of rushing into the Volsungs. Okay. I'm actually going to share my screen with you for a minute so I can show you some pictures and perhaps family tree things that might help you follow along a little bit better, especially if this is not familiar to you, and also show you a bit more about what a powerful place this had in Norse literature and art. Now, forgive me, I was teaching during the semester when everything went to Zoom, but I've still never been extremely good at using Zoom. So I have to remind myself how to do the screen sharing thing. Let's see. And if I can't figure it out, it will actually be okay. You'll just have to bear with me as far as names. Oh, it says host disabled. It says host disabled.
I'm going to give command to the Zoom over to you, and hopefully you can do that, because I'm not good at figuring out how to share screens either.
Okay. Yeah, it said host disabled. So if you do make me host, I'll do the I'm the captain now thing. All right. So it says start share. I think that's how this works. Okay. So
you're in business.
You see it? Okay, good. All right. So I mentioned that the poems are often quite old that are collected in the Poetic Edda. And by the time that the Poetic Edda is written down in the 1200s, those poems are already somewhat disorganized, right? You often have one poem that discusses one character's youth, a different poem that maybe gives a different perspective on that character's youth, a different poem about how that character died, maybe 3 different versions of how that character died. And these stories are all kind of disconnected and a little bit chaotic. But someone in the 1200s in Iceland already felt that way and decided that it would be a good idea to try to collect them into one cohesive story. And so that is what we call the saga of the Volsungs, which is actually written in prose or ordinary language, even though it's based on these old poems. And that's what I'm showing you here. So by default, when I refer to the Volsung stories narrative, I'm going to be referring to the version in the saga, unless otherwise specified. So let's look at a couple episodes from the Volsungs mythos, and then see just how old and how tightly integrated they are into the sort of Norse cultural language and world they are. So first of all, this is a family tree for the saga of the Volsungs. As you can see, there's a lot. This isn't even all the names mentioned in the saga, of course. These are just the people who are in the mainstream of the Volsungs family line. You can see at the very top is actually the god Odin. So, like many of the heroes of Greek myth, the Volsungs heroes and other heroes of Norse myth are descended from the gods. And the gods, particularly Odin in their case, do take a lot of interest in their fate, both helping and sometimes hurting them. And then at the very bottom, I believe that would be about 10 generations down, Harald Fairhair is a historical Norwegian king from the late 800s who, at least traditionally, claimed descent from the Volsungs himself. So you have at the very top a connection to the highest levels of divine myth, and at the very bottom in this family tree, at least a tenuous connection to quote unquote real history, which is not atypical of heroic myths elsewhere. And this family tree is from my translation. I'll come back to it if I need to draw attention to a name or something. But if we focus on one particular episode, we have the hero Sigmund, who you can see his name is X'd out here because he's dead by the time this particular episode I want to highlight has begun. Sigmund is, let's see, he would be something like the great grandson of the god Odin. And Sigmund receives a sword from Odin and does some very brave deeds of typical Viking style, defeating his enemies, taking over a kingdom, etc. But eventually, as he gets into, maybe his 30s or 40s, he's not as strong as he was before. He's maybe getting to be about my age, and he's not Tom Brady, so he does age. The god Odin wants to make sure that he harvests him for his army of dead warriors in Valhalla. And so Odin actually engineers his death. But his son Sigurd, who is down right in the middle of the slide here, Sigurd will inherit the sword that his father received from the god Odin, and he will be fostered in his youth by a dwarf named Regin, who you can see at the top left here. Now, Regin is a pretty typical dwarf character from the Norse sagas. If you've ever seen The Lord of the Rings or many other kinds of modern fantasy, the portrayals of dwarves are very closely modeled on the portrayals of dwarves in Norse myth. So they tend to be at least pictured as sort of shorter, although not maybe as comically short as they're sometimes presented today, shorter individuals with great craftsman abilities. But one of the weirder things about them in actual Norse myth is they also often change into animals. Well, Regin says that he thinks that his foster son Sigurd, a young Volsung hero, needs to do something to prove himself. And he says the perfect thing for you to do to prove yourself would be to slay a dragon and take its treasure. And so Sigurd has his sword, which Regin has actually reforged from pieces, as when his father Sigmund died, the sword had actually been shattered. If you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, that may be a familiar detail to you as Tolkien borrows it for the sword of his hero Aragorn. So Sigurd has a sword that can accomplish the task, but he doesn't know where there's a dragon. But Regin tells him, well, in fact, my brother, Fafnir, is a dragon who has a great treasure that you can take. And he tells him how this came to be. He says, I have two brothers, Fafnir and Otter, who you can see at the top left here. And our father was this man named Hreidmar. And my brother Otter was literally an otter. And I've indicated that as best I can with the emoji that seemed closest to me to an otter, the bear emoji. And Otter lived as an otter. And as otters do, he would eat by lying on his back with his eyes closed. And one day, some of the gods were walking past the riverbank where Otter lived, and they happened to see where Otter was eating a salmon, lying on his back with his eyes closed, eating a salmon. And so the god Loki picked up a rock and said, watch me catch an otter and a salmon with one rock. And he threw the rock and he killed Otter, hence the red X over his name right here. Well, they picked up the otter and the salmon he had been eating, and they walked along, and they came to a home in the woods that happened to be owned by Hreidmar. And they said, would you give us hospitality for the night? And of course, as in many ancient and medieval societies, hospitality is a very central cultural tenet. Well, Odin takes them, or Hreidmar takes the gods in, but the gods say, well, even though we're relying on you for a place to stay tonight, we didn't come empty-handed. We brought food. And they present this otter, not knowing that the otter is in fact Hreidmar's son. So Hreidmar tells them, you are going to need to pay me back for the murder of my son. And the way that I want that done is I want you to skin him, a little bit strange seeming perhaps, skin my son and fill the skin as a bag with gold, and then cover the skin all over with gold. Now the gods say, where is there that much gold? Well, Loki says that he knows where he can get that much gold. He knows a fish who has a huge hoard of gold. So he goes and catches this fish, forces him to give over his huge treasure of gold. But the last ring that the fish hands over, or maybe fins over, the fish puts a curse on. It says, this ring will cause the death of whoever owns it. So Loki and the gods come back with this huge treasure. They skin Otter, fill the bag that his skin makes with gold, cover the skin over with the gold, and then present it to the father Hreidmar. Well, Hreidmar says, this isn't quite enough because there's the one whisker sticking out of this gold pile. You need to cover that with gold too. And at that moment, one of the gods pulls out the last cursed ring and puts it on top of that whisker. So Hreidmar has received a huge golden treasure and payment for his son Otter. But then his other son, Fafnir, kills his dad, Hreidmar, takes all the treasure, and turns into a dragon. I don't know how he turns into a dragon. It just states exactly that. He turns into a dragon. Now, a lot of details here are going to be familiar to you if you know Tolkien, right? We have the cursed ring. We have the kind of obsessive desire to possess that cursed ring, which we see in that the gods even tried to hold back the ring and greed for it as well. And we see, of course, the hero Sigurd has his sword that's been broken into pieces. And if you've ever seen one of the Ring operas by Wagner, of course, he makes a huge use of the story too. Okay, so out of our flashback, Regin the dwarf tells the young Volsung hero Sigurd, that's where I know there's a dragon you can slay and a big treasure that you can take. So Sigurd agrees to slay the dragon Fafnir. Now we have one of the most famous scenes in all of Norse heroic poetry and sagas. Regin leads the hero Sigurd to the cave where Fafnir lives, shows him the track that Fafnir slithers down when he goes to get water. And Sigurd decides, well, I'm going to dig a pit in the middle of this track. I'm going to wait for the dragon to slither over me when he goes and gets water, and I'm going to stab him from underneath where the dragon will be more vulnerable. So he starts digging a pit. And Regin runs away because he's scared of his brother, the dragon. But as Sigurd is digging the pit, he's approached by an old man with one eye, which is always a sign in the sagas that Odin is here. The heroes never recognize the god Odin, even if he shows up many times in their life, as he does in Sigurd's life. But because he wants to encourage the career of this young hero, he shows up and gives him critical advice at different junctures. So the one-eyed god Odin tells Sigurd, you're being foolish to dig just one pit, because dragon blood is poisonous, and if it falls on you, you'll be killed by the poison. You need to dig several smaller pits around the pit that you hide in, so that the blood of the dragon will spray into those pits and not hit you. I guess that dragon blood sprays out like one of those, anti-fire water sprinklers in a ceiling. Well, Sigurd does that, hunkers down in his pit, waits for the dragon to slither over, and then stabs it from below. Sure enough, the blood goes into the other pits, and he himself is not killed. The dragon dies sort of slowly. He actually has a pretty long conversation with Sigurd as he's dying. And one of the last things that the dragon does is warn Sigurd that Regin will cause his death too. Right? He says, "My brother betrayed me, and he's going to betray you as well. He's going to want the treasure." Well, Sigurd ignores this initially, and when Regin comes back, because Regin's been hiding, Regin says, "Sigurd, will you do me a favor? Will you take the heart out of this dragon, my brother, put it on a spit, build a fire, and cook the dragon's heart so that I can eat it?" Sigurd says, "Sure, that seems like a reasonable request to me, I suppose." So he starts cooking this heart on the fire, but in the process, Sigurd decides he's going to test and see if the heart is done. So he sticks out a finger to touch it and burns his finger on the dragon's heart. When he retracts his finger, he puts it in his mouth to cool it. And of course, here you might think, well, he's tasted dragon's blood, which is supposed to be poisonous. What's going to happen to him? Is he going to die? But in fact, no. Maybe cooking dragon's blood changes its properties, or tasting it is different from getting it on your skin. But now he understands birds. And the birds who are around him talking tell him, just like the dragon did, that Regin is going to kill him. So Sigurd takes the same sword that he killed the dragon with, and he kills Regin. Okay, that's a pretty condensed version of a fairly long story. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat. But the reason that I run through the story is not to make this just story time, even though I think these stories can be pretty fun, but to show you that even though this is written down in the 1200s in Iceland, we can see a lot of evidence that the story is much older than that. Not just in the fact that sometimes the language in one of these poems will be much older than the language of the time it was written down, but also in art that survives from other times and places in the Norse world. So for example, you might have seen stave churches, which look like this. These traditionally shaped churches from Norway that have kind of a terraced look. Pretty unusual. Some of these survive. Recent evidence to suggest that some of them may actually be as old as the 1000s, which would be just in the first few generations after the conversion to Christianity. Well, not this stave church, but a stave church that unfortunately no longer exists, at least in its complete form, had scenes from the exact story I just told you carved on its doors, probably around 1200 AD. So I hope you all can see this okay. This is Regin reforging Sigurd's sword. And then Sigurd tests it by swinging it onto an anvil. Before he goes out to kill the dragon, he says, "I need a sword that will cut through a dragon. So I got to make sure it's not just a common everyday sword. It's got to be able to do some pretty unusual heroic tasks." So he decides to see if he can cut through an anvil, and he can with it. So he knows that it's good enough for his dragon killing errand. And then here he is killing Fafnir. It's, you know, it's medieval art, so it's maybe not as precisely representational as we might expect art to be today. It's hard to see where his pit might be, for example, but he's stabbing the dragon from below, like in the story. And then he cooks the heart of the dragon here. And you can see him putting, I've always, the way the text makes it sound is maybe it's pointer finger, but here it looks like he's putting his thumb in his mouth after he burns his finger. And then the birds start talking to him. The text describes them as what I believe are wagtails, these little black and white birds. But after they talk to him, they tell him, kill Regan. So here he is killing Regan. And that is the second to last or the last one of these panels. I guess it's the second to last. And then the last one, we see him loading up his horse Grani with the treasure. You can see a little treasure box on the horse's back. And then you can see the birds that were talking to him. They're a little bit under the horse, kind of tangled in some branches there. So it's pretty cool to see, again, even though the story is written down in Iceland, a long way away in Norway before the story is written down, clearly something nearly identical, if not identical, is being told in Norway. We don't have any names or any writing on these doors that tell us what's going on, but they correspond so closely with the story from the saga that it's hard to imagine there would be anything else. But even more surprising than that, because this is still roughly almost contemporary with when the saga is written down, we have stones from yet 200 years earlier that actually depict scenes from the very story I was just telling you. So this is the Ramsund carving from Sörmland, Sweden. Difficult to see right here where it's in true color. But if we look at a tracing, which I admit is from the somewhat nefarious Wikipedia, but it's the best tracing I've ever seen of this, we can see pretty clearly pictures that represent some of those very same events. Now, someone else added the numbers to this tracing, so they're actually not in sequential order, but I'll go through them, in the 1, 2, 3 order, so you can follow with me a little bit more easily. So in number 1, we see Sigurd with his thumb in his mouth, like in the Norwegian door carvings. He has fire. This, if you can see where my mouse is, the kind of twisted horn looking symbol is how they usually draw fire. So he has something over a fire, presumably the heart of the dragon. You can see next to him some smith's tools, because Regan, of course, is a dwarven smith. So we have Regan's tongs, his anvil, his bellows, and his hammer kind of lying around here. I guess he carried them with him to kill the dragon with. If we zoom over to the right at number 2, we see the birds who are going to talk to Sigurd. If we swing all the way back to the left, again, I didn't put these numbers here, to number 3, we see the beheaded Regan, surrounded again by some of his tools. In the middle, number 4, we see the horse with the treasure on top of his back. Again, actually very similar to the way it's represented on the Norwegian church doors from 200 years later. At the very bottom, number 5 marks, of course, Sigurd stabbing the dragon from below. And then at the top left, number 6, the little animal, as I mentioned, it's medieval art. They're not necessarily excellent representational artists. It's usually presumed that this little animal is the otter whose death kind of started this whole thing. So there we have pictures that would make no sense to us, except for the fact that they represent exactly the story that's there in these poems and sagas written down in Iceland, 200 years and more than 1,000 miles across ocean from where this stone was carved. So these are powerfully influential stories in the Norse world, represented in art like this, much more than any stories about the gods are that at least that are preserved. And the stories are remaining incredibly consistent over a pretty long period of time. I'll also show you while we're here. This is the yuk carving, also from Sweden. The pictures are a little harder to see. I've never found a good tracing of this, but they're very similar to the ones in the Ramsund carving, which is roughly contemporary with this. So we've got Regan beheaded, surrounded by his tools. You see his bellows, his hammer. We have a horse, looks kind of like a camel with a bump on its back that probably represents treasure, like in the other two artistic representations. We have the bird that's going to talk to Sigurd. We have Sigurd stabbing the dragon from below, like in the other one. So very, very similar. In the chat, I see Scott asks, do the runes also align with the story? Somewhat incredibly, from our perspective, no, the runes have nothing to do with what's pictured. So if we go back to the Ramsund carving here, at the bottom, the runes say pretty clearly, Sigurður Gjörðibur Þessi Muther Alrix Tutur Orms for Salu Holmgers Father Sigurðar. So someone named Sigurður made this bridge. There was apparently a bridge nearby 1,000 years ago. She was the mother of Alric and the daughter of Orm. She made it for the soul of Holmgeir, the father of Sigurðar. So maybe her husband. Interestingly, actually, too, the language here is Christian. For the soul of, the word soul, there, sola, actually only comes into Old Norse from English missionaries. So this is not made in a pagan context, but in a Christian context. It's still passing down stories that originate in the pre-Christian world. The same thing is happening in Iceland when these sagas and poems are written down. Iceland's been Christian for hundreds of years. And then the exact same, the runes here don't have anything to do with the story. They're a lot harder to see because of the nature of this photo, but you know, it's pretty standard stuff. I see people's names. So-and-so carved. It's nothing to do with the Volsung story. Now that opens up maybe its own kinds of questions. Why are these pictured here? But to me, it's a little bit maybe, and this is me going off on a bit of a limb, but a little bit perhaps like in a graveyard today, someone who, just to give you a real example that I see often, has like a rodeo scene on his gravestone. Perhaps he's someone who liked rodeo, so the family is remembering, you know, their rodeo fan or rodeo star by showing a rodeo scene on the grave. Perhaps the person commemorated in a stone like this is kind of a quote fan of these Volsung stories, and in a similar way, the family is kind of commemorating that that fandom, to use a very modern word. But it's pretty hard to say exactly why you would have these pictures that are so unrelated to the content of the actual writing. Or maybe I'll come back to just normal presentation for a minute. Or maybe it's something different entirely. Maybe the words long predate the picture, and or the pictures long predate the words, so that someone has found a stone that was already prominent, that already had a prominent picture of scenes from the Sigurd the Myth, and decided, well, people already look at this, so I'm going to add memorial text so that people see that, you know, I'm remembering my husband, father, friend, what have you, and something like that. But it's extremely common in memorial runestones that they have pictures that could not possibly have anything to do with the life of the person commemorated there. We have scenes of Ragnarok, the gods fighting their enemies at the end of the world on otherwise pretty simple memorial inscriptions, including from after the conversion. So something is going on there different from just mere representation of someone's life or the desire to write out the story itself. All right. I fly with you a lot and I can't see you, so I don't know if I'm driving everyone to tears of boredom here or anything else. Can I address any questions, comments, clarify anything? Feel free to use the chat or say anything. Okay. So, as I said, these stories go way back, and we can be assured not just on linguistic evidence, but also all of these artistic occurrences that have nothing to do with the specific place and time that the stories are finally written down, that the stories are very, very old. In fact, as a kind of a minor side note, but still an interesting derivation from that, the poem Beowulf, written in Old English, right, not in Old Norse, somewhere between 800 and 1000 AD, contains the earliest known references to Volsung heroes, including Sigmund, Sigurd's father. So quite possibly, even probably, these stories go back even more centuries to a time when the English and the Norse were still one language community, one culture, before the move of the Anglo-Saxon tribes to Great Britain. All right. I'll show you some other stuff. So another story that we have, before I go back to the screen sharing thing, another story we have from the Volsungs that I'll tell more briefly for fear of driving more of you to tears of boredom, is long after Sigurd himself dies, spoiler alert, the Dragon Slayer Sigurd dies, his wife, Gudrun, is remarried against her will to Attila. Yes, Attila, because they incorporate famous names from earlier European history into the sagas too. And Attila believes that her two brothers are hiding Sigurd's treasure from him. And so he has them tortured and killed. And one of her brothers, Gunnar, specifically, is killed by being thrown into a snake pit with his hands tied behind his back. And to demonstrate that he's still, a top of the line, bold warrior who doesn't care for these, for physical pain and won't show fear even in a snake pit where he's going to be bitten to death by poisonous serpents. His sister throws him a harp. They sound not very useful, but he plays the harp with his toes while he dies, again showing his courage, his fearlessness. That scene is also extremely commonly pictured on art from the Viking Age, and I'll show you some of that now too. Hopefully this works. So here is Gunnar. This is also on the Hillestad Stave Church, the same one that is the scenes of Sigurd killing the dragon Fafnir. So you can see him described just like in the saga. He's looking pretty chill, kind of lying back, his hands behind his back, and he has his toes, in this case, on something that looks a little bit more like maybe a lyre than a harp, but still playing a musical instrument with his toes while snakes envelop him and begin to start biting him to death. We also see it on a baptismal font. So again, these stories are surviving well after the conversion. Maybe better than stories of the gods are, because of course you can tell these stories while minimizing the gods' roles. This one is a little bit hard to see, but he's standing up here. You can see his hands are tied behind his back, and he's got snakes starting to surround him. And then we have on a probably pretty early picture stone. This probably is pre-Christian. This is from Huninga on Gotland. These stones are difficult to date, but perhaps from the 700s, 800s. Here's a zoom in on the scene where he's at. Little hard to see, but you can see these little kind of slug-looking snakes are surrounding him. You can see him by his beard right here, and here's his sister, identifiable by her long hair falling behind her there. Oh, you're still looking at the Guk carving. Okay, that's interesting. I'm very sorry. I'm doing something wrong. Okay, now do you see? I'm sorry, I'm still getting used to Zoom. Frankly, still getting used to PowerPoint. I never taught with PowerPoint. Okay, great. Sorry about this. Okay, so what I was saying is this is from the same stave church door that we see Sigurd killing the dragon on. But here we have Gunnar lying back, hands behind his back, playing a musical instrument with his toes. This one maybe looks a little bit more like a lyre than a harp, but certainly a reference to the same story. And this is the baptismal font, where he's standing up with his hands tied behind his back as the snakes come after him. And it looks like the picture is vague, but he could be standing on perhaps a musical instrument there. And this is the picture stone I referenced, very old, maybe 700s, 800s. This is certainly the oldest one of these anyway. Gunnar is lying on his back, surrounded by these kind of squiggly representations of snakes. You can recognize him by his beard jutting out here on the, toward the left, and his sister on the right with one hand over the edge of the snake pit. Maybe she's just thrown something in or is about to, and she's recognizable by her long braid in her dress. I'm very sorry. I hope you'll pardon me for not coordinating the slides like I intended to there. Okay, I'm going back to regular presentations for a second. So examples could be multiplied, but I think that those two are particularly interesting. You have these really vivid and very vividly described scenes, again, written down in the 1200s. And we could imagine that 1200s poets or 1200s equivalents of novelists are making these stories up to satisfy an audience in their time. But instead, it appears that they're actually drawing on extremely old and very well-known stories that have been circulating for a long time all over Scandinavia and even into England and even into Germany. Right, the German Nibelungenlied tells many of the same stories in a pretty different way, but close enough with a lot of the same names that you can tell that it's originally the same story. I find that pretty fascinating. I think that the analogy then with the Iliad or with Star Wars is apt for the Volsungs. I'm not going to tell you the whole Volsung story. It is fun, I think, but I would direct you to my translation or videos where I discuss it on my YouTube channel. Now I'll talk a little bit more about some other mythical heroes, because it's not just the Volsungs, although the Volsungs certainly stand tallest in this pantheon. Are there other questions, remarks, criticisms, clarifications, something I can address here? So the Saga of the Volsungs, in its most canonical form, although it has more and less canonical forms, as you would expect with a story this old. Covers about 7 generations of that family, but it is also often followed, and in fact, in the only old medieval manuscript that we have, it is followed by another saga, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. I hope you can see the book cover that I put on screen share there. So in my translation of the saga of the Volsungs, I go straight into the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. Now, Ragnar Lothbrok is a semi or pseudo historical figure. Some of the events in his life could be sort of dated into the 800s AD. But in his saga, he has taken pretty firmly out of that semi or pseudo historical background, and he is made the husband of a fan inserted child of the dragon slayer Sigurd, who actually isn't in the saga of the Volsungs. So just like today, if you read fan fiction about Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, any of those things, you'll find people, making up their own minor characters or saying so-and-so got together with so-and-so and they had this kid. You see the exact same things with these sagas. And the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok is, in a sense, medieval fan fiction, following on the heels of the runaway success of the Volsungs legends. So that is another of these mythical hero sagas. And then just scroll. Then there's more. My most recent book, I translated 2 more sagas of mythical heroes. So the saga of Hervor and Haedrek and the saga of Rolf Kraki and his champions. And if you think that someone would get tripped up on all of these names pretty easily, even after years of studying and reading and even translating this stuff, you are correct. I myself get tripped up on these names pretty easily. That's why my books always include very prominent family trees for trying to keep track of these people. These 2 sagas don't have much to do with each other or with the saga of the Volsungs. They weren't as famous as the Volsung stories, but they are themselves pretty exciting, pretty cool narratives of Viking Age heroes. The saga of Hervor and Haedrek, the first one in that collection, has scenes that have to be made into a movie someday. I can't see how they haven't been yet. One of the most memorable is the Hervor of the title is a warrior woman who finds out that her father wasn't the man she'd been told. Right, a little bit shades of Star Wars, but was in fact a great warrior who was buried with a famous magical sword. And so she goes and she breaks into his burial mound and encounters his zombie, and winds up, they exchange lines from a actually very archaic poem where she says, "Give me the sword," and he says, "I can't give you the sword, it's cursed." And she says, "Give me the sword." And it goes back and forth. It's kind of a rock opera, right? This Viking woman and her zombie dad fighting over a cursed sword. It sounds like a Black Sabbath album, and I'm surprised that modern media hasn't made more of it than has been made of it. And then that saga also includes the stories about her son Haedrek, who goes on to be a legendary Viking king, and who personally encounters the god Odin and has a riddle contest with him. And the riddles that Odin gives him are, in fact, I want to say 40 of the 41 preserved riddles in Old Norse, which is kind of fun, although they are terrible riddles, if I do say so myself. If you'd like, I can throw some of these riddles at you and see if you can solve them. Might be an interesting little bit of communion you can do with medieval literature and culture here. But I'll wait for someone to request that if you want it. Okay, Stevie says yes. So I'll share some blame. Okay. I'll screen share so that you can read these. And remember, I warned you. They're not great. Okay. This one's actually pretty all right. I left my home. I made a journey from home, and I saw a road of roads. There was a road under it, and a road over it, and a road on every side. All right, so what is he talking about? What did he see? Anybody have a guess? A river is a good guess. Yeah, a river is part of it. So the road of roads is a bridge because it's a road that connects roads. The road under it is a river. The road over it and on every side is because birds are flying over and around him, and their quote unquote roads are the air that they fly through. That is the solution. If you give this to a 7-year-old, the 7-year-old would probably say that you are not a very fair riddler. Another example. This one is probably my favorite because it's my least favorite. I saw an earth dweller from the soil. A snake sat on a corpse. A blind one rode a blind one to the wave-filled sea on a horse without breath. I will give anyone 500 made-up points if you can guess what Odin is talking about in this one. 500 made-up points, redeemable for all kinds of made-up prizes. All right, I don't see any guesses. Okay, worm is good. Yeah, so there is a worm involved. The earth dweller from the soil is a worm. Okay. Snake and worm is the same word in Old Norse. So the worm is on a corpse. A blind one on a blind one because the worm doesn't have eyes, and neither does the corpse. Or, well, worms don't have eyes, so they're blind. A corpse is dead, so a corpse is blind. So blind one on a blind one is a worm on a corpse. It's just restating the same thing. And then the corpse is on a dead horse, hence the horse without breath, and they're on the river. So I saw a worm on a dead man, on a dead horse, on a river. That is the solution to the riddle. So that's what you get in the riddles of Odin, and there's about 40 of them. It makes sense when you break it down because you possibly guess it, right? Again, a kid encountering these riddles would cry because you weren't giving them much to work on. Horse without breath, you could maybe, Desiree says, would that be a boat? You could maybe take it poetically that way. Norse poetry is very elusive, but I think from the way that it's explained in the prose after the riddle that it's meant to be interpreted much more literally. All of the riddles are pretty weird like this. So that's Hervor and Hathrak, a little appetizer about that one. And then that same book, Two Sagas, also includes the saga of Rolf Krake and his champions. I'll real quickly show you that title. Rolf Krake and his champions. So Rolf Krake is a legendary Danish king who accumulates 12 heroic champions, and they go off and do various heroic things like try to conquer Sweden by themselves. But Rolf Krake also encounters Odin in a very memorable, weird magically tinged episode in that saga. And one of his champions is, again, talking about Beowulf, a clear analog to Beowulf. He is a bear-like hero. Beowulf is very often compared to bears. The hero in this Norse saga is literally the son of a bear, and they both go from Sweden to Denmark to fight a monster menacing the hall of a king of Denmark. Yeah, that's so. Timothy said it's still on two sagas. That's what I was showing you. Was just that book. It contains that saga too, Rolf Saga Kraka, the saga of Rolf Kraka and his champions. And then beyond just these ones that I've translated, there's it can be difficult to count because some of them actually kind of flow into one another sequentially. But there's 20-ish, maybe as much as 24 the sagas that count as mythical heroic sagas, just bizarre stories full of gods and dragons and dwarves and elves and weird quests and warlocks and wizards and giants and all these things. They are medieval fantasy movies in a way. And even though it's only really with Volsungs and maybe Hervor and Haderach that we can see the old poetry that they're based on, potentially many or all of them also go back to traditions that maybe date many centuries before they were written down in Iceland in the 1200s and 1300s. How are we doing? Questions, remarks? I'm going to hand host back to Matthew Cumberledge. Renounce my power to share the screen. Other questions, remarks about anything connected to these sagas, the myths, or other Norse topics that I can address for you? Let me be a resource to you and try to be worthy of your time this evening. You all are in Pennsylvania, right? But you're more Steelers territory than Eagles territory tonight, I hope.
Very much so. We're southwestern Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I was thinking about that a few hours ago. I'm about to talk to a bunch of people from Pennsylvania, but I think they're Pittsburgh territory. So. Oh man.
Oh, actually, somebody in the chat's from Chicago.
Oh, okay. Well, congratulations, I suppose. Janice asked about links where the books can be purchased. These books are available all over the place. You can get them on Amazon. You can get them straight from my publisher, Hackett Publishing. One fun option, if I haven't completely disgusted you with the topic, is if you go to Boulder Bookstore, their website, I'll just type this right here. That's a bookstore local to me, and they sell autographed books, if that sounds fun to you. But otherwise, you can get them anywhere, really. Flattering question. I enjoy these sagas. When I've taught Norse myth and Icelandic saga survey courses, I've really enjoyed going through these with the students. Sometimes they get a little bit sort of blizzarded by all the names, but one of the helpful things PowerPoint can do is help you put all those names up on the screen. Andrew asks, I thought I saw a Templar cross in one pictograph. Is that possible? It was certainly a cross. As I mentioned, those picture stones, other than one on which we saw the Gunnar and the snake pit myth, are all post-Christian. So you get a mix of pagan and Christian imagery, if you can call the mythical heroes pagan, since they're not gods. They can be kind of adapted into a Christian context a little bit better than gods. Something like you sometimes see heroes like Achilles in the Middle Ages too. Remember actually some of the pictographs, to use that word, picture stones, that actually even depict stories about the gods. are stones with Christian messages on them and even crosses on them. So there's interesting syncretism going on. Other questions, remarks that I can address? And I'm not trying to go short on you. I'm trying to not stretch your patience. So just let me know what I can do for you. Well, I'm easy to reach. If you, Matthew Cumberledge can certainly give you my email if there's resources that I can help you find, if you'd like to find some of these other sagas. Another book that I can recommend, that you're going to think this is something different than it is, but I'm going to type this in the chat. There's a book called 7 Viking Romances. Now that sounds like, bodice rippers or something, but it's romance in the old sense. The title's pretty misleading. It's, adventure stories. That contains some other mythical heroic sagas that I haven't talked about here. One of the fun ones it contains is the saga of Eroad, who lives for 300 years and has 300 years of blockbuster adventures, including one that takes him to the New World, to Vinland, what the Norse called the eastern coast of Canada. So that's a fun one in addition to the ones that I talked about here. Trying to remember if there are other good English translations of other ones. One problem that you get into with English translations is so often, because these books are old, translators want them to sound old, right? So they translate them with thou and thee and kind of Shakespearean language that can be off-putting to me. Not that I don't like Shakespeare, but I don't like people pretending to be Shakespeare. And it's sometimes harder to appreciate just how zany these stories are when you have to focus on understanding the artificially archaic English, right? Like I can put up with the Old Norse. I practice reading that every day, but if I want to read Shakespeare, I'm going to read Shakespeare. I'm not going to read somebody writing in the 1960s. So that's a problem you run into with some translations, but 7 Viking Romances is not translated like that. And you might enjoy some of those zany stories if you like some of the appetizer that I've given you here. That also includes a saga called the Saga of Egil One Hand. This guy loses his arm in a fight and has a dwarf make him a new arm, but the new arm is actually a sword. So his entire right arm is a sword now. And of course, he manages to fight with that better than he did before with a sword in the actual hand. It's just, like I said, it seems like B-sides off of Black Sabbath albums, but these are stories that are sometimes 800 years old or potentially even much, much older. Yeah, I find it kind of funny. So speaking on a meta level, this is still weird to me, these Zoom presentations. When COVID first hit in early 2020, it was the latter half of the 2019-20 school year. And so everything went to Zoom and I never got used to it. Of course, I have a YouTube channel where I don't expect to talk to an audience because I'm just talking to a phone in the woods. But when I actually know that an audience is there, there's still something weird to me about this, like talking to a computer and there being people back there.
It is a bit unusual for me still as well.
Yeah, now I sound like I'm from the Neolithic, but it's been a lot to get used to over the past several years. Other questions, remarks, things I can do for you?
Yeah, anything else before we wrap up?
Well, very kind comments from Timothy and Janice. Thank you. Like I said, Matthew Cumberledge can can get you in touch with me if you'd like to email and get specific references and things like that. Happy to help or address other questions connected to this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Just shoot our office an email. Yeah, I can't speak tonight. Just shoot our office an email and we can get you in contact with Jackson.
Thank you all for taking the time this evening. We all have you all have other things you could have done with your Sunday evening. I'm flattered that you took some time to listen to me talk about weird old sagas. But please do reach out if I can do anything more for you.
We were very happy to have you, and I want to thank everybody for coming to this presentation. I know we don't do Zoom presentations that often, so it was great seeing everybody here.
Yeah, and it would be fun one day if I'm in that area to stop by physically. I've been in Ohio, Pennsylvania, off and on over the past few years, so it could happen again. I'll let you know if it does.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, I will wish you all the very best.
All right, and thank you again, Jackson.
All right. Good night, all.
Good night.